Hey everyone, George here. I just wanted to sit down real quick and have a conversation with you about a movie that is in a franchise that I absolutely love. Today I want to talk about the 1986 film Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. This film was directed by Tom McLoughlin, and this film stars Tom Matthews, Jennifer Cook, David Kagan, Kerry Noonan, Renee Jones, Tom Fridley, Vincent Gustafaro, and C.J. Graham as Jason Voorhees. With that out of the way, let me tell you what this movie's about. And basically, this is the 6th installment in the Friday the 13th franchise. So in Part 4, the final chapter, Tommy Jarvis kills Jason Voorhees. And Part 5, A New Beginning happens, and it was not actually Jason who the killer was. It was someone posing as Jason Voorhees, which most people were unhappy with. So in comes Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, where Jason gets resurrected. Basically, it opens with Tommy Jarvis going to the cemetery, digging up Jason Voorhees' body, and long story short, Jason's body gets struck by lightning, and he comes back to life in some sort of like Frankenstein monster scenario. And, long story short, Jason goes on a killing spree again in Crystal Lake. Real quick, I am going to spoil this movie. I know it's a Friday the 13th movie, and this movie, came out back in 1986. But in case you haven't seen it, I would say stop this video, go watch the movie, then come back, sit down, and hear what I have to say about this film, because it's a really, really fun movie. So this movie, Part 6, is the exact moment in the franchise where Jason went from being just a young boy who was believed to be drowned and then grew up in the woods and became a wild man in the woods and witnessed his mother killed and went on a journey of vengeance, right? That part of his life is done. He is no longer that. After this point, Jason Voorhees is very much just a monster movie creature. He is a Frankenstein monster. He is this undead, unstoppable force of nature, just storming through everything and laying waste to everything in his wake. You can make the argument Part 4, he very much was that in Part 4, and that's true, but he was still a person. He was still a human being. And it showed that because he died at the end of Part 4, right? In Part 6, it's very clear that he is very, very difficult to kill because he's not even alive anymore. So that's why I wanted to sit down and talk about this movie, because it's really fun, and this is the moment, in my opinion, when Jason went from being just a slasher movie villain to a monster movie creature. So as I was saying, Tommy Jarvis and his buddy were driving to the cemetery and they dug up Jason's body, right? So, Tommy Jarvis was the same character in Part 4, the same character in Part 5, and this character in Part 6. So as I was saying, this movie opens up with him and this other guy driving to the cemetery to dig up Jason's grave. And it's really interesting that they gave him a burial. They didn't just cremate the body, they actually gave him a burial, which implies something really kind of fascinating. I personally do not believe that the 9th installment in the movie, Jason Goes to Hell, takes place in the same universe as the Paramount movies. I believe that is like a multiverse Jason. But that means there are other Voorheeses around, right? I don't know, they had to bury, they have a gravestone and everything, and they don't have a date. They don't have an age. It's interesting. They don't have the date of when he was born and when he died. I just think the logic of that would have been too complex, so the director and the people behind this film just decided, hey, let's leave out any born and death date on this gravestone. But it's really fascinating is, I don't know, either the state paid for a gravestone and his burial, or there is Voorheeses around in this world, in the Paramount universe. There are still Voorheeses living around somewhere, and I guess it was like a family plot And I guess they were cool with this creature man being buried in their plot. So the reason why Tommy Jarvis wanted to bury up Jason's body is, Tommy Jarvis killed Jason Voorhees in part 4. And at the end of the movie, it shows that he was haunted by Jason. They were going to go in a different direction with the franchise where Tommy Jarvis was going to be the new Jason Voorhees, which no one likes. It's weird. It just wouldn't work. And thankfully, they didn't go in that direction. But they started implying that at the end of Friday the 13th, part 4, right? And then, then part 5 happens, and you can see he's haunted by Jason, right? He's haunted by Jason Voorhees. So in the beginning of part 6, Tommy Jarvis is going to the cemetery to face his demons, right? He wants to dig up Jason's body and burn it. He basically wants Jason just to be a pile of ash and crumbled bones. That's it. So, by this point in the franchise, Jason Voorhees is just a dead person, right? He's dead. When you start really thinking about the logic of Jason Voorhees, things start falling apart. And this is definitely one of those franchises where you just sit back and enjoy the ride. Because the Friday the 13th movies are a lot of fun. In part 1, Pamela Voorhees was seeking vengeance for her dead son that drowned in the lake in Camp Crystal Lake, right? She was seeking vengeance. And then the ending of part 1 implied one of two things. So the movie could have really the franchise could have gone in two different routes from this point. There's that shot, that jump scare, where Jason Voorhees jumps out of the lake and grabs the survivor of the first one and pulls her under. They could have gone the route of a supernatural presence of Jason, where Jason was basically a ghost and he haunted Camp Crystal Lake. And that would have been actually a really interesting way they would have gone, but that's not the way they went. Basically, the way they went was Jason Voorhees survived. He didn't actually drown. He survived and lived in the woods on his own and just watched the events of Friday the 13th Part 1 play out from a distance because he was too afraid to interact with his mother, who he hasn't seen in years. And then he becomes a wild man in the woods. And then in Part 3, he gets the mask, and he starts, becoming a little more like that typical Jason behavior. But it wasn't really till Part 4 did he really become full-form Jason with the hockey mask and this kind of bulky, unstoppable man. But he was still human, as I was saying. And then Part 5, he was a dead person. And the very beginning of Part 6, Jason Voorhees was just a dead person. He was not alive. It wasn't until Tommy Jarvis dug up the body, opened up the coffin, got angry, took one of the pieces of the iron gates in the cemetery, took one of the poles from the iron gate and started stabbing Jason Voorhees' body. And finally, it was just stuck into his body, and Tommy Jarvis goes out to get his gasoline so he could burn the body. That's when lightning struck. And, it's silly, but that's when lightning struck, and then Jason Voorhees was brought back to life. And at that moment, from that point on, Jason Voorhees became this monster. That's why from Part 6 on, I can make the argument of Part 4, but, definitely Part 6 on, he's not necessarily a slasher movie villain, which he is. He does slasher movie stuff, right? But I do view Jason Voorhees as a monster, and I do view the later Friday the 13th films as monster movies. So Jason, this entire movie is basically Jason Voorhees walking from the cemetery to Camp Crystal Lake. The whole time he's just trying to get back to the campgrounds that he used to call home. I did say earlier that after Part 4, that chapter of his life is closed, right? That's not entirely true. It's built into his DNA, and he's still angry, and he still does seek vengeance. And so this movie is basically him walking from the cemetery all the way to Camp Crystal Lake, and along his way, he encounters teens all along the way that he deems as camp counselors, right? And some of them were camp counselors, some of them weren't. And, he also interacted with some other people in this movie, which was kind of fun, was he interacted with people that were like insurance salesmen. He encountered like some sort of corporate retreat where they were playing paintball out in the woods. So he's walking through the woods. He comes across this corporate retreat where people are playing paintball, and he slaughters them. But yeah, basically, he is just on his way to Camp Crystal Lake again, and he will keep going, and nothing will stop him. And if there's any person along his pathway that will get in his way, he'll just like mow through them. So in slasher movies, as a franchise grows and there's more sequels, you sort of up the body count and you up the stakes. And you start being more creative in the kills as well. That happens here, That definitely happens here in the Friday the 13th franchise. And in this movie, who he goes after, it varies a little bit. He definitely goes after like camp counselors, which was really cool in this movie was that this is, if you think about it, think hard about the Paramount Pictures Friday the 13th films, right? Think about 1 through 8. There are only 3 movies where there's camp counselors. Part 1 had camp counselors, but Jason was not killing in that one. Part 2 had camp counselors, and that was Jason, right? This is literally only the second movie in the franchise where Jason is actually going after camp counselors. And that's why this movie is fun, is that it was like reinventing Jason Voorhees. This movie reinvented him, but it was also a return to form because they decided to go back to a summer camp and deal with the summer camp. So in this movie, he dealt with teenagers, he dealt with camp counselors, he dealt with like middle-aged insurance salesmen, right? He also dealt with the entire police department as well, or more or less the entire police department. When he finally got to Crystal Lake toward the end, he basically was dealing with officers. So, it was kind of a wide range of people that he went after. And what's also interesting about this movie real quick, even though these people were not victims in the movie to Jason Voorhees, this movie was the first Friday the 13th film that actually had kids at the summer camp. Like, yeah, it was the first day of summer camp, right? But the kids were there. Part 1, the children didn't arrive yet. Part 2, the children didn't arrive yet. And then Part 3, it was no summer camp. Part 4, no summer camp. 5's not a summer camp. That was just a, like a home for troubled teens, right? Or troubled youths. Part 6 was a camp again. And they actually had children at the camp. So it was actually quite interesting to see that sort of interaction because you can make the argument, or it's not really much of an argument, it's mentioned throughout the movies that Jason basically still has the mind of a child. So it was interesting that Jason was moving through this camp and there were children there and he interacted with at least one kid. He interacted with one kid. The one that saw him is the one he interacted with. But he just sort of like walked by and just, he like looked and like then went on and just did his thing. This movie is quite original in a way. It's cliche. It does all sorts of standard slasher movie stuff. But it is original in the sense of like the victims in this film, in my opinion. So, like in every Friday the 13th movie, there's always that one kill that like really stands out. And everyone has everyone has a preference of what they think is like either the coolest or the most significant one or the one they remember the most from each film in the franchise. And I am going to say for Friday the 13th, Part 6, the most memorable one, I guess you can make the argument the most memorable one are the 2 teens in the camper, right? He gets into the camper and he does that really comical one where he slams the woman's face into the wall, and then it's like a Looney Tunes cartoon, and like the imprint of her face just pushes through the metal wall of the camper, and basically it makes like a perfect molding of her face, like screaming face. That's a very memorable one. And I'll also say the guy who was driving the camper as well.
Hey, Nikki, what are you doing back there? Taking a dump?
They did a pretty good job, a pretty interesting way where he, meets his demise, where he gets a knife to the ear. And when that happens, when he gets struck, the music just stops, and there's like the echo. And then that's when then the trailer tips over, and then it catches fire, and then Jason comes out, and he's standing on top of the trailer. Yeah, I would say that's probably the most memorable kill in this movie. Is really two. It's really the events that happened in that trailer. He saw the children twice. He actually made eye contact with one of the girls in the cabin. And he walked through the entire cabin with all the children sleeping. I don't think he would have actually harmed any of them. There is that shot, which I think is a really cool shot, where the girl is awake in the cabin, and then there's Jason Voorhees, and his mask is he's slowly moving toward the camera. I just think he's curious because she's awake, I don't think he would have harmed her. He ends up leaving because he hears the police. He hears the sound of the police and stuff outside. I don't think he would have harmed the girl. I don't think he would have harmed any of the kids. Because that's not who he's after. He's seeking vengeance from his mother, and he's seeking vengeance, I guess, for himself as well, where he's just angry at camp counselors and adults who stand in his way. So the survivors of this film are a few people, actually. So you have the group of kids, right? All the kids that were in the camp survive, right? None of them were harmed. Tommy Jarvis survives. Megan, which is the daughter of the sheriff, she survives. You could make the argument Jason Voorhees survives because he comes back in part 7. So he was just badly damaged. He didn't actually die at the end of part 6, right? So you could say Jason Voorhees survives the movie as well. There is one other person. The deputy sheriff survives this movie. He has a laser attached to the end of his pistol. That guy, he survives. Basically, he was at the police station when the sheriff was out doing investigating, and the team and the rest of the police department were doing investigating. And staying at the police station was Tommy Jarvis was in the jail cell, and Megan, the daughter to the sheriff, was there as well. Basically, Megan and Tommy make a plan to trick the deputy into getting his keys. So they get his keys, they get his pistol as well, and they lock him in the cell. And that's it. He's not in the movie again. So he survives the movie. He's just in the jail cell for the rest of the movie. Basically, they lock him into the jail cell, and they leave the police station. And you never see him again for the rest of the film. Meaning that the rest of the events that night, for the rest of that evening, he is still just stuck in that jail cell. So he actually survives because he fell for a trick. Okay, let's look at this for a second. All the police officers in Forest Green, because they changed, so this is the other thing in this movie, was they changed Crystal Lake to Forest Green. They changed its name because, they were moving on and trying to get rid of the dark legacy that town had, right? So Forest Green, the entire police department falls to the hands of Jason Voorhees, including the sheriff. The deputy is in the jail cell, right? He's the only one that survives. I'm assuming eventually he'll get out of that jail cell. I'm assuming he will take on the sheriff's role. Maybe he won't, maybe he will, but let's say he does. Let's say he becomes sheriff, right? He didn't need to deal with Jason Voorhees at all. At all. He didn't have to deal with him. He saw the victims, right? He saw body parts in the forest and stuff like that. But he didn't actually have to deal with Jason Voorhees himself in part 6, right? Let's say he's sheriff in part 7. He didn't have to deal with Jason in part 7 either. It was like a psychic girl and the ghost of her dead dad take him out at the end of part 7, right? They did the job. By the time the new sheriff, this guy, comes to the site where all these victims are, Jason's gone. He's dead. He's already brought to the bottom by the ghost of this girl's dead dad, The job was done. Problem solved, right? Part 8 happens, and then he's on a boat. And he leaves their jurisdiction. He goes down the Hudson River and ends up in Manhattan. At the end of part 8, all the pee and poo of all the residents of New York City just like pours on him down in the sewer and turns him from like this monster Jason into like a little boy Jason again, which is really odd, right? But that's what happens. And, basically he didn't have to deal with him. This guy lived in Crystal Lake. He lived in Forest Green and never had to encounter Jason Voorhees at all. I would say this guy probably interacted with, again, dealing with like the murder scenes and stuff like that in part 5 or definitely in part 4, like in the beginning of part 4, right? When there's a helicopter overhead, when they look at the victims of part 3 and the events of part 3, and they're all the police department's cleaning up what went on in part 3. I'm sure he's there. I'm sure he's amongst those people, that guy, right? And then I'm sure he's at the end of part 4, cleaning up the mess, like, or just investigating what went on, right? And like writing up his report, right? And then probably the same thing for part 5. But this guy does not need to come face to face with Jason Voorhees. So he might very well be the luckiest character in the entire franchise, in the entire Paramount Pictures franchise from 1 to 8. So the scene in this movie, the scene that I like the most is pretty early on in the movie. It's actually the second and third victims of the film. It's the moment when you understand what kind of movie this is. Basically, the two head camp counselors are heading to camp. They never arrive to the camp. They're driving in their Volkswagen down a dirt road heading to camp, and they come across Jason Voorhees. Basically, they just have this interaction, this fun interaction, or deadly interaction with Jason Voorhees that, is quite clever, very comical. And, you understand in this scene just what kind of movie it is. You understand that this is a movie where they'll make witty, self-aware comments. They'll look at the camera screen and wink figuratively at you. But yeah, I like this scene because it shows just how self-aware this movie is and just how fun this movie is going to be. This movie also, it's a good movie, very good movie in the franchise. It has a lot of classic moments in it as well. And of course, everyone knows the imagery of Tommy Jarvis trying to wrap the chain around Jason when they're out in Crystal Lake. I would say the same thing with Jason Voorhees after he gets out of the camper and he's standing on top of the camper that's on fire after he off 2 victims. Also, when he interacts with the insurance salespeople that are on their corporate retreat playing paintball, that's memorable. Tommy Jarvis in the beginning digging up Jason Voorhees and Jason coming back to life is very memorable too. There's just, honestly, there are so many memorable moments in this film. Also that shot of Jason slowly going toward the camera because he sees one of the kids is awake in the cabin and he's like really curious and he's going like he's bringing his face closer. That's a memorable shot too. This movie is very memorable. It's very cinematic. There's also like a really fun scene in this movie. There's a car chase scene in this movie that's really fun where Megan is driving the car and she has Tommy's head down in her lap, to keep down so they don't see him. And then she's just you could see that her character, you can see that she's done this before. She really knows how to like control her vehicle, and she's not afraid to control her vehicle in very extreme ways, and she's very good at maneuvering it around. So you can see she's done it a lot. She definitely has a rebellious personality. So this movie, honestly, just has a lot of memorable moments. I feel like almost every scene in this movie is a memorable one. So here's the thing about this movie. This movie, they basically like reinvented Jason in this film, right? It was almost like a reboot in a way. And they made it a little more commercial for people. There's no nudity in the film. The gore, like there's no like prosthetics of like limbs, and all these usually like Friday the 13th films have these kills where there would be you would see that they would have all these like prosthetic body parts and stuff like that, and they would have people die in crazy ways. In this movie, they don't really show a lot of that stuff. And it's really interesting is they try to compensate for that with like blood. There's a few times where blood just splatters on a window, right? I do feel like this was one of the ways that they try to compensate for there not being like some serious gore in this movie compared to like the earlier entries in the film. So like, what is the funniest scene in this movie? I don't know. I actually think this movie's quite funny. This movie's very clever. This is a very clever film. You know, it's not like some sort of like mind-bending Christopher Nolan film, but this movie is actually quite clever, very funny, very witty, very self-aware, and there's a few moments that like are quite comical in this movie. It's really hard to say what the funniest moment in this movie is, but I will say, and I think most people will agree too, it's this scene when he interacts with the corporate retreat. You know, all the insurance salesmen playing paintball, right? It's the scene where Jason gets his machete. You know, there's that scene where there's the guy just angry and just like, because he lost, and he's just like hitting away at like leaves and branches and stuff with this machete. And then Jason like grabs his arm behind him while this guy's like ready to do another whack with his machete. And he basically like throws the guy into like a tree, and the tree has like the smiley face, and the smiley face is covered in blood, you know. The next shot is what I would say is very funny, where Jason looks surprised. He holds up his machete, and the guy's arm and like hand is still attached to the machete, still gripping it, and like his arm is still attached to the machete. That's probably the most fun one, and probably the funniest one, I would say. But honestly, it's really hard to say what the funniest scene in the movie is. But I'm going to go with that one. You know, the ending of this movie is really fun. You know, like said earlier, the imagery of Tommy Jarvis trying to get the chain around Jason's neck while there's just fire all around the boat and all around the lake, and you know, where they are in the lake. I would say it's a really fun final confrontation. You know, it ends with him getting the chain on, and then him getting rescued by Megan, and then they cut to the lake. There's that shot that's like similar to like in earlier entries where you see a peaceful lake, and the camera just sort of like pulls in to like the surface, right? And then we go a little bit further, right? Normally it ends there, right? Instead, we dissolve to a shot that's at the bottom of the lake, which is Jason's body is chained to this rock at the bottom of the lake. And you go up close to, and you see a close-up of his eye, and his eye opens. I would say that is actually a very, very enjoyable ending to the movie. And I think that, yes, so I actually like the ending of this movie a lot. I think this ending is better than the ending of Part 5, and also of the next two entries that will follow Part 7 and Part 8. Another thing that was actually really fun about this movie is this movie has both a final girl and a final guy. So Megan and Tommy are the final girl and final guy in this movie. And you know, Tommy Jarvis is an entertaining character, and the final girl in this movie, Megan, is one of the better final girls in the Friday the 13th films. You know, they really had fun with this one. She was the daughter to the sheriff. She had a little bit of a rebellious spirit to her. And you know, you could tell that from the car chase scene in the movie where she was like running from the cops in her car and going in reverse, and she wasn't afraid to make crazy maneuvers with her vehicle. And it showed that she sort of did these things before. So yeah, the final girl, Megan, was very good. And obviously Tommy Jarvis is also very good in this movie. So it's actually fun is that this film had both a final guy and a final girl. So as I mentioned earlier, this movie is quite clever and it's really funny. This movie is very interesting in the franchise because they reinvented Jason in this movie. Then you had part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. He dies in part 4, right? Part 5 was not Jason, and they resurrect him in part 6. And you know, they reinvented him. They basically brought him back, and they made him basically into Frankenstein's monster by this point. And I personally feel like from this point on, from like 6, 7, and 8, they're not really, they're slasher movies, but it's really, I consider them like creature features, like monster movies from that point on. in the franchise. And, this movie was actually quite clever, and I do think that people need to take note today when they're making reboots of films of how to properly reboot a franchise. So it's not like they're rebooting it, but in a way they are sort of breathing new life into the franchise. And I do think people today need to take note when they want to reboot a franchise and look at films that actually did it well. And I do think this movie, Part 6, did it very well. It's very self-aware. They really had fun with it. They knew what they were doing, and they were perfectly okay with it. They knew what kind of movie it was. They weren't trying to make it anything different. And they just really had a fun time making this movie. And there were just so many nods and winks to the camera. And it wasn't done in a way that you would see in the Scream movies or a Kevin Williamson script. They do it in a way where it just was subtle. It was subtle, but it worked. It worked pretty well. Well, that is the movie Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. I really enjoy this movie. I think it is definitely one of the better movies in the franchise. I love all the movies. Obviously more than others. But Part 6 is a very special one. It's a very fun one. It's a very easy one to digest. If you know a person who's never seen a Jason movie, I think Part 6 is a good entry point into the franchise for someone who's never seen a Jason movie. Because it's just fun. It's just easy to take in. And I think it's actually very well made and very cleverly written movie. So I'm assuming you've already seen this movie, but if you haven't, you should absolutely see it. And do you have to see the Friday the 13th films in order? I don't know, maybe. But if you've never seen any, you can start with 6 and then go back and then watch the other ones. Just go whichever way you want. But, I think 6 is a very good introduction as to who Jason is. So if you have never seen one before and never seen this one, by all means, go rent it right now and watch it. And if you've already seen it, watch it again for the millionth time like me. Bye.